April 28, 1945, Reims, France. The war in Europe was dying, but not yet dead. In the early hours of the morning, General Dwight D. Eisenhower stood alone with a map spread across a wooden table. Cigarette smoke hung in the air. Red and blue arrows clawed across Germany, converging toward a single burning word, Berlin. Somewhere east of the Elbe River, Soviet artillery thundered day and night. Somewhere west of it, General George S. Patton's Third Army was racing forward, engines hot, crews exhausted, smelling the end. Patton wanted Berlin. He had said it openly, angrily, relentlessly. His tanks were closer than anyone expected. His men believed they could take the city before the Russians sealed it shut. To Patton, Berlin was not just a target, it was the final prize. The proof of American dominance. The symbol that the United States, not the Soviet Union, had broken Hitler's Reich. Eisenhower knew this, and still he hesitated, because this was no longer just a military decision. It was a political one, soaked in blood and shadowed by the future. The alliance that had crushed Nazi Germany was already cracking. Every mile gained now would echo into the post-war world. Every order carried consequences far beyond the battlefield. On paper, the objective was clear: destroy the German army. Berlin, Eisenhower believed, was no longer militarily necessary. But history does not unfold on paper. It unfolds in moments like this, when a single command can decide the fate of nations. By the end of that day, Eisenhower would give an order that stunned his generals, infuriated Patton, and reshaped Europe. He would stop at the Elbe. The order reached the front quietly, but its impact was explosive. On April 29, 1945, American units of the Ninth Army stood on the western bank of the Elbe River, staring across the water at a collapsing Germany. The river was narrow in places. Engineers said pontoon bridges could be thrown across in hours. Patrols reported scattered German resistance. Berlin was less than 100 miles away, and then came the halt. Advance no further. Hold position. Prepare to link up with the Red Army. For the men at the front, the command felt surreal. They could hear the war ending just beyond their reach, distant artillery, the echo of a city dying. To soldiers who had crossed France, smashed through the Siegfried Line, and watched friends fall in the mud of the Ardennes, stopping now felt unnatural, almost obscene. No one took it harder than George S. Patton. From his headquarters in Bavaria, Patton erupted. He called the decision a tragic mistake. He wrote in his diary that the Americans were throwing away the fruits of victory. He believed, with unshakable conviction, that the Soviets could not be trusted, and that whoever took Berlin would shape the peace that followed. Patton was not alone. Many American officers quietly agreed. They had seen Soviet methods. They knew what followed in the wake of the Red Army, and they understood symbolism. Berlin was more than a city. It was the heart of Europe. But Eisenhower was unmoved. He had already calculated the cost. Intelligence estimated that taking Berlin would kill 100,000 Allied soldiers, perhaps more. And for what? A city already assigned to the Soviet occupation zone under agreements signed months earlier. The war, Eisenhower believed, had to end cleanly. Not in rivalry, but in coordination. Yet as American tanks idled at the Elbe, another army surged forward with a very different vision of victory. To understand Eisenhower's decision, one must step backward, months before the Elbe, before Berlin became a race instead of a ruin. In February 1945, on the shores of the Black Sea, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin gathered at Yalta. The war was clearly ending, but the peace was not yet written. There, in a palace scarred by earlier battles, lines were drawn that would soon harden into borders. Germany would be divided. Berlin, deep inside the Soviet zone, would itself be split among the victors. Eisenhower was not at Yalta, but he would be bound by its promises. By spring, those promises weighed heavily. The Red Army had paid a catastrophic price, advancing from the east. Millions dead, entire generations erased. Stalin expected Berlin as compensation, a blood-earned prize. To deny him now, Eisenhower feared, would shatter the alliance while the war was still smoldering. And there was another fear, less spoken, more dangerous. Intelligence reports warned that German forces in the southern Bavaria and Austria might attempt a last stand, the so-called Alpine Redoubt. If American armies lunged toward Berlin, they could leave their southern flank exposed, allowing Nazi diehards to regroup and prolong the war. Eisenhower's priority remained singular: end the conflict as fast as possible. Berlin, he concluded, was a distraction. But strategy is never neutral. Every decision carries a moral weight. By choosing coordination over competition, Eisenhower placed faith in diplomacy over instinct. He believed that post-war agreements would hold that shared victory, would lead to shared responsibility. Patton believed the opposite. As Soviet forces closed in on Berlin from the east, reports of looting, reprisals, and mass violence followed in their wake. American officers heard whispers from refugees, fragments of a darker future forming beyond the Elbe. Still, the order stood. The Americans would not cross. And as April bled into May, Berlin became a killing ground, claimed by one army alone. April 30, 1945, Berlin. The city was already dead when Adolf Hitler pulled the trigger. Above ground, Berlin was a furnace of smoke and rubble. Soviet artillery pounded block after block into dust. Infantry fought room to room, cellar to cellar, against boys and old men pressed into the Volkssturm. The Red Army closed in on the Reich Chancellery, with a vengeance sharpened by years of unimaginable loss. This was not liberation. It was retribution. As Hitler's body burned in the garden, the battle did not stop. It intensified. Soviet commanders pushed their men forward without pause, knowing that the race was not just against German resistance, but against time. Every hour mattered. Every flag raised carried meaning. West of the city, American soldiers listened to the radio reports in stunned silence. Berlin was falling and they were not there. On May 2nd, the German capital surrendered to the Soviets. The red banner rose over the Reichstag, captured in a photograph that would define the war's end in Europe. To the world, it looked like unity. Behind the image, the fractures were already visible. In Berlin streets, the cost was staggering. Civilians suffered immensely. Mass rapes, executions, and looting spread in the chaos that followed victory. Some Soviet officers tried to stop it. Many could not. Others did not try. Eisenhower received the reports and said nothing publicly. The war was ending. The alliance had technically held, but the price of Berlin was now irreversible. An entire city and soon an entire half of Europe would fall under Soviet control. For Patton, this confirmed his darkest fears. He would later say that stopping at the Elbe was the greatest mistake of the war, that the West had surrendered the future without firing a shot. History, however, does not judge in absolutes. The question remained, was Eisenhower's decision an act of restraint, or the moment the Cold War truly began? Victory in Europe was declared on May 8, 1945, but peace did not arrive with it. Across the shattered continent, American and Soviet forces met along the Elbe in carefully staged handshakes. Photographs captured smiling soldiers, raised arms, the illusion of brotherhood. Yet beneath the smiles, mistrust was already calcifying into doctrine. Patton saw it first and said it out loud. In the weeks after Germany's surrender, he grew increasingly vocal. He warned that the Soviets were not partners, but future enemies. He bristled at orders to cooperate, to share resources, to repatriate prisoners. In private, and sometimes not so private, he argued that the United States had made a fatal error by stopping short when it had overwhelming power. Eisenhower, now supreme commander of the occupation, faced a different reality. He had to hold the alliance together long enough to manage the aftermath of total war. Millions of displaced civilians wandered Europe. Cities had no food, no power, no governance. And in the East, Soviet armies were not leaving. They were entrenching, installing friendly governments, dismantling factories, and redrawing societies by force. Berlin became the epicenter of that tension. Though divided into 4 sectors, the city sat like an island deep inside Soviet territory. Every supply convoy, every rail line depended on Soviet tolerance. Eisenhower understood that a confrontation, now so soon after victory, could ignite a new war before the last one had fully cooled. Patton did not care. He pushed back, openly criticizing Soviet actions and American restraint. His outspokenness unsettled Washington. In a world desperate for stability, Patton was a reminder that peace built on compromise could still feel like defeat. Within months, he would be sidelined. The war had ended, but the consequences of stopping at the Elbe were only beginning to unfold. By the summer of 1945, the map of Europe no longer showed battle lines, it showed borders. They were not the borders anyone had fought for, but they were the borders that remained. From the Baltic to the Balkans, a red shadow stretched westward, hardening into what Churchill would soon call the Iron Curtain. The Elbe River, once a temporary line of coordination, had become something far more permanent. Eisenhower watched this transformation with growing unease. He had believed that cooperation in victory would lead to cooperation in peace. Instead, Soviet authorities moved quickly and decisively. Political opponents disappeared. Non-communist parties were crushed. Elections were staged. Eastern Europe was being sealed off, country by country, without the sound of marching armies, only the quiet pressure of occupation. Critics would later say the warning signs were obvious, that stopping Patton had handed Stalin not just Berlin, but legitimacy. That power once conceded is never returned willingly. Eisenhower understood those criticisms, but he also understood the alternatives. The United States was exhausted. The public wanted demobilization, not confrontation. Millions of soldiers were shipping home. The atomic bomb, still secret in July, had not yet reshaped strategic thinking. A clash with the Soviet Union in the heart of Europe would have meant another catastrophic war, fought by armies that had already bled themselves dry. So Eisenhower chose restraint. Patton, increasingly isolated, continued to speak bluntly. He compared Soviet policies to Nazi tyranny. He questioned denazification programs and criticized Allied governance. His candor made him a liability. In October 1945, he was relieved of his command. 2 months later, Patton was dead, killed in a car accident in Germany. The general who had wanted to race to Berlin never lived to see what that city would become. A divided symbol of a divided world. And Eisenhower, hailed as the architect of victory, would carry the weight of that decision into history. In June 1948, Berlin became the battlefield Eisenhower had tried to avoid. Without warning, the Soviets severed all land routes into the western sectors of the city. Rail lines were cut, roads were blocked, power supplies strangled. 2 million civilians were suddenly trapped, more than 100 miles inside Soviet-controlled territory, with no clear way out and no clear way in. Stalin believed the West would blink. Instead, American and British aircraft began to fly. What followed was the Berlin Airlift, one of the most audacious logistical operations in history. Day and night, cargo planes descended into the city, landing every few minutes, carrying food, coal, and hope. Pilots flew in fog, ice, and darkness. Some crashed, some died, but the flights never stopped. For Eisenhower, now a senior statesman and soon-to-be political leader, this was the consequence of stopping at the Elbe. Berlin, once dismissed as a non-essential objective, had become the symbolic front line of the Cold War. And this time retreat was impossible. The airlift succeeded. After 11 months, the blockade collapsed. The Soviets backed down, but the division was complete. 2 German states emerged. NATO formed. The Cold War solidified into permanence. Patton's warnings echoed louder in hindsight. Yet Eisenhower's defenders argued just as fiercely. The airlift proved that resolve did not require invasion. That strength could be measured in endurance, not conquest. That restraint in 1945 had preserved the fragile peace long, enough for new strategies to emerge. Berlin stood alive, divided, defiant, and the Elbe River remained what it had become on that April day in 1945, the invisible line where one war ended and another began. When Dwight D. Eisenhower became President of the United States in January 1953, the shadow of the Elbe followed him into the Oval Office. He was no longer a general commanding armies, but the architect of a world shaped by restraint. Nuclear weapons now defined strategy. A direct clash with the Soviet Union no longer meant another. Berlin, it meant annihilation. The logic of stopping short in 1945 had become the foundation of global survival. Eisenhower understood this better than anyone. Behind closed doors, he spoke often of limits, of what power should not do, even when it could. He rejected calls for rolling back communism by force in Eastern Europe. He refused to turn Berlin into a trigger point for war, even during repeated crises. The lesson of the Elbe had matured into doctrine. Avoid the battle that cannot be won without destroying everything else. Still, the criticism never faded. Historians debated whether the Cold War could have been shaped differently. Could Berlin have been taken by the West without breaking the alliance? Could Eastern Europe have been spared decades of authoritarian rule? Or were those outcomes already sealed long before American tanks reached the river? The answer depends on how one measures victory. Patton measured it in momentum and dominance. Eisenhower measured it in endurance and survival. One believed history rewarded boldness. The other believed it punished recklessness. Berlin itself became the final argument. In 1961, concrete and barbed wire split the city in two. Families were severed overnight. Guards faced civilians across a no-man's land of ideology. The wall stood as proof that the decisions of 1945 were not temporary, they were permanent. Yet Berlin did not fall, it endured. And in that endurance lay the unresolved legacy of Eisenhower's order. A world spared immediate catastrophe at the cost of prolonged division. By the time the Berlin Wall fell in November 1989, the argument that began at the Elbe was finally coming to an end. East Germans flooded through checkpoints, climbing concrete barriers that had defined their lives for nearly 3 decades. Guards stepped aside. The world watched as a divided city became whole again, without a single shot fired. It was the kind of ending Eisenhower had always believed in, even when few others did. History, at last, offered perspective. The Soviet Empire collapsed not through invasion, but through exhaustion. Its control over Eastern Europe unraveled under economic strain, political pressure, and the quiet persistence of people who refused to accept permanent division. The map changed slowly, peacefully, without the catastrophic war Eisenhower had feared. In hindsight, the order to stop at the Elbe appears less like surrender and more like delay, buying. Time for a different kind of victory. Yet the cost of that delay cannot be ignored. Millions lived and died behind the Iron Curtain. Entire nations endured repression, surveillance, and lost generations. The moral weight of that suffering lingers, and critics still argue that it might have been prevented if the West had acted decisively when it held overwhelming power. But power without restraint is not wisdom. Eisenhower's choice forced the world onto a narrow path, one where survival depended on patience, diplomacy, and the terrifying balance of nuclear deterrence. It was not heroic in the traditional sense. It did not deliver immediate justice, but it avoided a war that could have ended civilization itself. The Elbe, once a river of hesitation, became a marker of something rarer in history, a moment when force was held back. And that restraint, controversial, painful, imperfect, may have been the most consequential victory of all. On the surface, the order Eisenhower gave in April 1945 seems simple: stop at the Elbe, do not advance, let the Soviets take Berlin. But history is rarely shaped by simple commands. That single decision sits at the crossroads of 2 eras. Behind it lay the most destructive war humanity had ever known. Ahead of it stood a new kind of conflict, colder, longer, and infinitely more dangerous. Eisenhower sensed that crossing the Elbe might win a city, but lose the future. Patton believed history belonged to those who seized the moment. Eisenhower believed it belonged to those who knew when to stop. Neither man was entirely right, neither was entirely wrong. Berlin fell in ruins, scarred by violence and division. Eastern Europe vanished behind the Iron Curtain. The Cold War consumed generations, and yet the world did not burn. Nuclear weapons were never used in anger. The superpowers circled each other for decades without crossing the final line. That fragile outcome traces back to a table in Reims, a map marked with arrows, and a commander willing to accept criticism in exchange for restraint. Eisenhower never claimed moral certainty. He spoke instead of responsibility, of the unbearable weight of command, where every option carries suffering, and inaction can be as costly as action. Stopping at the Elbe did not end conflict. It delayed catastrophe, and sometimes in history delay is everything. The war ended, the world divided, and one order, given in the quiet hours of a dying war, reshaped the balance of power for the rest of the century. That is why Eisenhower halted Patton at the Elbe, and why Berlin, for better or worse, fell to Stalin.